The soldier had just stepped through the front gate after years away when he froze. In the corner of the old house, his son was crouched down, eating pig feet in silence, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But it was what the child said next that broke him. What could make a child forget he was even human? Before we begin this emotional story, if you believe that kindness can save a child, leave an amen in the comments and tap a heart so we can spread compassion together. Sometimes one story is all it takes to warm the heart of someone lost in despair. A faded canvas bag rested neatly at his feet. His military jacket still carried the scent of dry soil from the last training camp. Michael Reese sat quietly, hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes fixed on the stack of papers folded inside his chest pocket. No one on the bus paid him any attention. Among the scattered long-distance passengers, the only thing that drew a glance was the strange silence that followed him. "How long has it been since you were last home?" The driver's voice came from the front without turning around. His name was Mr. Calvin Brooks, about 60 years old, steady hands on the wheel. "More than 4 years. Your boy's probably going to run out and hug you. Kids, you know, they feel things more deeply than grown folks." Michael paused for a few seconds. "I don't even know if he remembers my voice anymore." Mr. Brooks nodded slightly, fell quiet for a moment, then spoke again slowly. "There's been some talk around town lately. They say there's a child locked up somewhere. Folks claim he's being treated badly, fed like an animal. But you know how people talk. Who really knows?" Michael didn't answer. He slipped a hand into his chest pocket and pulled out an old piece of paper, so fragile it felt like it might tear with a breath. Streaked with stains from what could have been rain or tears, the handwriting was still visible, messy and trembling, as if written by a small hand struggling in the dark. "Dad, today I dropped my bowl of rice. She said it'd be better to feed pigs than to give food to me." No one laughed. The words drifted through the air like a taut string stretched between two distant minds. Michael continued reading silently. His eyes blinked but remained dry. "One time I spilled my bowl of rice. She said even pigs deserved better. She said feeding me was worse than feeding the pigs." Outside the bus window, the field slowly faded behind them, but inside the vehicle, time felt as if it had stopped. "Did you ever write home?" Mr. Calvin Brooks asked. "Many times." No one replied. "Eventually, I stopped. I figured either no one was reading them or no one wanted to reply." After a long pause, the driver lifted one side of his mouth into a small smirk. "What's your son's name?" Michael tightened his grip around the bundle of letters, eyes fixed on the far edge of the horizon. "Aiden. Maybe by now they call him something else, but to me, he's still my son." A gust of wind slipped in through the window crack. A piece of paper fluttered from Michael's hand. He tried to catch it, but missed. The paper sailed past the front seat and landed near Calvin's feet. The old man picked it up and handed it back without looking at it. "Be careful not to lose that. Kids don't write letters to let them fly away. They write them to be read." Michael gave a small nod and slipped the bundle of letters back into his chest pocket. No thank you. No smile. Just silence. The bus jolted as it hit a pothole on a narrow curve. The bump startled a passenger in the back seat, prompting a soft yelp. Then everything went quiet again. A young boy, fast asleep against his mother's shoulder, wore a straw hat tipped off to one side. Aiden used to wear a hat like that. Michael instinctively touched his shirt collar. The simple gesture stirred something deep inside. "What do you think?" Calvin asked, eyes still on the road, now painted gold by the afternoon light. "What if the story about that child being locked up is true? I won't let him spend another day in that darkness." Michael's voice was steady. He didn't raise, it didn't emphasize anything. Each word opened an old wound, one not deep but never healed. Calvin mulled that over, then he murmured as if talking to himself, "In this part of the country, folks are used to forgetting the names of kids no one stands up for." The bus began its descent down a dirt hill. The rhythm of the tires thudded like a slow drumbeat of memory. Below them, clusters of small houses came into view, emerging faintly through a light haze of dust like old smoke. Michael leaned against the window, closed his eyes not to rest, but to search a corner of memory that had no images, only sound. Once a child's voice had giggled behind him, asking questions about the scar on his left arm, about stars that sparkled, and about stories he used to tell by the campfire. That child used to call him Dad. Now, all that remained were echoing fragments without names and a kind of formless ache. But in this moment, all he had left was a crumpled letter. Memories don't need to be sharp. They just need to show up at the right time. The bus slowed down. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked hoarsely, then fell silent. An elderly man carrying a pole of melons walked slowly across an empty lot. He glanced at the bus but didn't call out to anyone. Michael remained still, not turning around, as if looking back was something he'd refused to do for a long time. He said just one sentence, not aimed at anyone in particular. "This time I didn't come home to stay. I came back to find the one who never really left." Calvin didn't say another word. Maybe he understood. In places like Ridgefield, there are people who don't return to relive memories. They come back for the first time to face what they've never had the courage to name. There are places that once you return to them are no longer what they used to be, but instead become proof of what has been lost. And the one who hurts the most is not always the one pushed out, but the one who once believed they would be welcomed back in. Michael Reese stood still for a long time, his hand resting on the rusted metal gate. The small sign that once read, "Mendoza Family," had disappeared as if erased by memory itself. He didn't knock. He didn't call. His hand merely touched the gate's handle for a second, then withdrew quietly, as though he had touched something that no longer belonged to him. The air was heavy, thick, as if everything around him was breathing in a different rhythm, foreign and cold in the place that once held warmth. He walked around the side alley of the house where as a boy he used to run with Rachel to escape their mother's piano lessons. A cracked set of stone steps marked by time led down to the backyard that was once familiar now, about to become the place that would redefine a father's heart. Under the shadow of a warped wooden frame, Michael saw a rusted metal trough stained with dark-crusted water residue. There were no animals left, but the sour, rancid smell lingered thick in the air. His eyes locked on the scene. His breath paused, then slowly resumed. From the direction of the trough came a rattling sound, like a spoon scraping the bottom of an empty bowl. He walked forward slowly. No words, no questions. At that moment, every instinct in him seemed sealed away. In front of certain truths, no confirmation is needed. A boy around 7 years old in clothes so filthy you could barely tell their color or his skin tone. He was kneeling beside the trough, carefully picking through leftover scraps in the moldy green-streaked water. No crying, not even fear, only a kind of resignation that sent a chill down Michael's spine. A voice shouted from behind the house, "What are you doing? That food's for pigs. Are you fighting them for scraps now? Can't you see you're no different than a pig?" A whip cracked through the air. It didn't strike anyone, but the sound alone froze everything around. The boy flinched quickly, lowering himself further. His shoulders trembled slightly, a reflex no longer under control. And then, when he looked up, his eyes met the man standing in the distance. For a moment his lips pressed together, then began to tremble. Tears rolled down his cheeks. He didn't sob out loud, but his small face shattered in silence. "Dad, don't speak loudly. They punish you here if you talk without being asked first." The words weren't loud, but they struck Michael's ears harder than gunfire. He moved closer, eyes never leaving the child. "Are you Aiden?" The boy didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He just stared back, his eyes still wet and red. Then, as if he couldn't hold it back anymore, he broke into tears. The sound was soft, broken, almost silent, but unbearably heavy. For the first time in months, he cried in front of someone who wouldn't punish him for it. A woman stepped out from the house. She was still holding the whip, her steps halting as she saw the man standing between the trough and the boy. "Michael, why didn't you let me know first? I only punished him lightly. He's so stubborn, you know that. I'm just strict with him, that's all, but if I had called ahead, I might not have seen what I needed to see." Michael didn't yell. He didn't have the kind of anger that comes out in shouts. War had drained that from him long ago, but his eyes at that moment didn't need sound to freeze someone to the bone. Aiden lowered his head and reached for a piece of banana peel that had fallen to the ground. His hand trembled gently, whether from hunger or habit, it wasn't clear. Michael reached out and stopped him gently but firmly. "My son is not a pig. And you're my sister. How could you treat your own blood like this?" Rachel clenched the whip tighter, then let go. It fell to the dry ground, breaking like the mask she'd been wearing. She didn't say another word. There was no defense that could stand against the image of a child eating scraps from a pig trough. Michael lifted his son into his arms. Aiden gently wrapped his arms around his father's neck, his breath soft as if afraid to disturb the moment. He rested his head on his father's shoulder, as if waiting for something warmer than an embrace. From inside the house, a shadow passed quickly across the window. No one came out. No one intervened. They walked across the yard, the back door still left open, as if it no longer wanted to hold anyone in. As they turned out through the side gate, a few eyes peeked from behind the curtains. The figures behind them were vague but full of judgment. In small towns, people get used to seeing without speaking, hearing without remembering. Not until Michael's footsteps left the old tile floor did the space exhale a long, heavy breath. He didn't look back. Neither did Aiden. They left behind not just a house, but a whole layer of memories that had been denied. On the way back, Michael walked along the dusty dirt road, the cuffs of his pants coated in fine red clay. Aiden stayed silent. Every now and then he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to shut out the world. Michael asked softly, "Do you remember the last person who called you by your name?" Aiden shook his head. "I don't remember. Maybe when Mom was still alive." Silence stretched between them. Michael didn't ask anything more. In his heart, it felt like he had just entered a new kind of battle, not fought with bullets, but with patience and love. When they reached the small room he had rented on the edge of the town market, Aiden fell asleep on an old wooden chair. Michael laid a blanket on the floor and gently draped his coat over the boy. He looked at his son's thin face, the small scar on his left cheek, the bruise beneath his wrist. None of it was from a fall. It was the mark of abandonment. He let out a quiet sigh, not from exhaustion, but because some wounds take longer than a lifetime to heal. Still, he knew someone had to begin that healing, and that someone had to be him. At a corner of the market, the tamale vendor watched the father and son walk by and muttered under her breath, "Some folks fight wars for 10 years and come back not realizing the real enemy was living inside their own house. But still, if a good man's heart is still beating, he'll find his way home eventually." They say it right, not every door needs a key to be opened. Some only open with the truth. And sometimes that truth is the hardest thing we have to touch in order to begin again. Not every wound leaves a mark on the skin, and not every child has enough tears left to describe what they've been through. Some kids grow up in the silence of their pain when the tears have dried long before they ever learn how to spell the word sadness. They say that in the dry season there are afternoons when the sky stands still, but inside, something trembles. Michael Reese didn't fully understand that truth when he stepped into his house. He understood it when he walked out carrying his son, a boy who no longer knew how to cry out when he was hurting. The door to Dr. Helen Carter's clinic swung open. No bell rang and none was needed. She didn't speak right away. Her eyes scanned the tall, broad man and the small boy walking beside him as if they were carrying a crumpled memory between them. Her eyes had grown used to people who hurt in silence, but something about the boy made her pause. They sat down, but neither spoke at first. Michael gave a slight nod, just enough to acknowledge her. Aiden, sitting back on the edge of the chair, let his legs dangle above the floor, like he was afraid that just touching down would make him disappear. His small hands gripped the edge of his father's shirt, clinging to the only anchor he had in this unfamiliar room. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Helen's voice was gentle, like she was asking a tree if it knew what it was called. The boy didn't answer. His eyes drifted along the wall and stopped at a faint crack in the ceiling. Helen didn't push. She quietly jotted down a note on her pad, "Male." About 6 or 7. Temporary name, Aiden Reese. Michael leaned toward his son. "Are you tired? Want some water?" The boy shook his head. It wasn't a refusal, just a reflex. Helen stood, walked around the desk, and gently knelt in front of him. "Can I take a look at your hand for a moment? I won't hurt you. I just want to see." For the first time, Aiden looked at her. His eyes were dark and deep but unreadable. Slowly, he raised his left hand. His wrist was covered in faded bruises, along with small scars that looked like they came from ropes or rough cloth being tied too tight. Helen touched the wrist lightly, using no more than 3 fingers. Even so, the boy recoiled as if her hand were made of burning iron. "These marks are old," she said softly, "but it looks like they have happened more than once." Michael looked at his son, then turned away. "I don't know exactly what happened, but I know it wasn't an accident." "Was the boy ever tied up?" "I think so, maybe as a punishment, or to scare him. I used to be a soldier. I've seen grown men fight each other, but I've never seen a child stay that silent when they're in pain." Dr. Helen Carter picked up her pen and made a note. Then she looked up. "Do you know what he's afraid of?" Michael looked at her. He paused for a long moment. "He's not afraid of belts or the dark. He's only afraid of being forgotten." The room fell quiet as if the air itself had been drained. Helen stood up and reached a hand out toward Aiden. "Would you let me weigh you, sweetheart? I promise no needles." The boy nodded again. He didn't smile, didn't react, but he nodded. For the first time, Helen heard the soft sound of small feet stepping onto the floor. When he stood up, the hem of his shirt lifted slightly, revealing how thin his hips were. Not bone exactly, but definitely not flesh. "He's malnourished," Helen said. "His skin shows signs of vitamin B deficiency. He's probably been eating leftover scraps without enough protein." She looked at Michael. He nodded, then spoke slowly, as if each word had to be pulled from deep inside his chest. "I saw him sitting next to the trough, quietly picking out little bits of food that were left behind. Pig slop, in the corner of a pen. He ate it without even looking up, like it was completely normal." Helen froze. The words sliced straight through the space between them. She opened a drawer and pulled out a child nutrition logbook. "Would you let me file for an emergency intervention? If needed, I'll write a letter requesting a hospital transfer." Michael took a moment to answer. "I don't want my son to become a case file. I just want him to live like a normal kid." Helen nodded. "But to live like a normal kid first, he has to be recognized as human." Michael's phone vibrated in his pocket. He excused himself and stepped outside to answer the call. When the door closed behind him, Aiden was still standing near the scale arms wrapped around his shoulders, like he didn't know what to do next. Helen walked over and sat down beside him. She didn't ask anything. She simply held out a piece of candy. "Do you know this kind of tastes like strawberries, not like pig feed?" The boy took it, but didn't unwrap it. A moment passed. Then softly he asked, "Ma'am, if my dad really came back, do I get to sleep inside the house?" Elena felt her heart tighten. The child didn't ask if he would get to eat, go to school, or be loved. He asked for the most basic right, one that adults often forget: to have a place in his own home. "Your dad is back," she said gently, "and from now on, no one has the right to make you feel like you're asking permission to live in your own house." The boy looked at her, his eyes searching as if trying to figure out whether there really was a place in the world meant for him. It wasn't a pleading look or a suspicious one, but a quiet flicker of hope reaching out for shelter. Michael came back into the room and saw the two of them sitting together. He stepped forward, knelt down, and placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "Dr. Carter's going to help you get better, but I'm not going to leave you alone again." Elena stood up and handed Michael a sheet of paper. "This is the preliminary report. He'll need more clinical evaluation, but I've written down his condition clearly. If anyone questions you, you can use this." Michael took the paper, folded it in thirds, and tucked it into the pocket over his chest. "I don't want anyone reading my son's file like it's a news story, but if it's what I need to protect him, I'll do it." Before they left, Aiden paused at the doorway. He turned to look at Elena with a quiet expression. He didn't say a word. He simply placed the unopened piece of candy back on her desk carefully, like a silent thank you. The door closed behind them. Elena sat down and turned to a new page in her notebook. She wrote one more line. The body didn't cry, but those eyes were already screaming for help. In the long hallway, Aiden held his father's hand. That small hand no longer trembled, but it hadn't yet learned to grip tightly. And Michael, for the first time in years, had learned how to protect his son, not by command, but by showing up completely and unconditionally. Because some things you only realize once they're gone should never have needed permission to exist in the first place. Not every morning begins with the smell of coffee or the sound of roosters. Some days memories rise before the sun has a chance to, and what pulls you out of bed isn't an alarm clock but a picture from the past playing in your head. Michael Reese walked slowly through the iron gate, holding nothing but a worn, crumpled envelope. He wasn't exactly coming home. He was stepping into a house that had once felt like family, and now stood as a hollow shell of memory. In the yard, the clothesline hung dry and stiff like it had never known children's clothes. The rough tile ground bore no footprints, only faded water stains curled like the wrinkles on an old man's face. His hand touched the wooden door frame. The creaking door let out a sound like a stifled sigh. It wasn't locked and didn't need to be because everything worth protecting was already gone. The faint smell of sour oranges hung in the air. In the living room, Rachel Monroe sat with her back to him, her cream-colored silk robe making her skin look even more pale. The glass of orange juice in her hand was nearly empty. "If you came here to blame me, you're too late. I don't have the strength to hear it anymore." Her voice came from inside, steady and cold like a drop of dew on the rim of a glass. She didn't get up or even bother to turn around. Rachel was Michael's younger sister, once the only person who understood him without a word. But that very understanding was now the reason they couldn't repair what was broken. Sometimes people avoid each other not out of anger, but because they know each other too well to pretend things are okay. "I'm here to take what belongs to Aiden, the documents, the birth certificate, the ID papers, even the little things you might have forgotten about but mean the world to him. I want to take everything. I don't want to leave a shadow behind." "Then take it. But don't come back here looking to assign guilt. I raised him like my own. Not everyone would have done what I did." Michael stared at his sister. His gaze didn't blink. Something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but a level of clarity that could cut. "Do you remember when he was 6? He wrote a letter in pencil, all crooked lines, asking why no one called him to dinner. He thought it was because he didn't wash his hands. I didn't know how to answer, because back then I still believed maybe you truly cared about him." Rachel set her glass down. The soft clink of glass on wood echoed lightly in the room. She stood tilting her head slightly. "I did my best. He was stubborn, quiet, didn't want to be near anyone. I couldn't treat him like a regular kid. I had to be tougher with him. I never asked you to love him like a mother. I just hoped you wouldn't make him live every day feeling like he was something to be ashamed of." The click of the metal latch at the back door cut through the heavy air. The door creaked open, and Margaret Maggie Collins appeared, bundled in a faded wool shawl, her short round frame clutching a basket of dewy herbs. She stepped in slowly, like unsure whether she should go forward or turn around. Her eyes scanned the room and froze when they landed on Michael. A faint, uneasy smile crossed her face, pale as the light near dusk. I brought some parsley for Rachel. We have too much at home." Rachel turned away. Michael didn't avoid her gaze. "Did you see him being locked up?" Mrs. Margaret looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "I heard him crying, but I couldn't be sure where he was. A few times, I noticed the pig trough was spotless every morning. I just guessed." "You guessed and said nothing." "Mr. Reese." Everyone in town saw how hard she worked to raise that boy. On her own, no husband raising her brother's child. And everyone stayed silent. Because watching someone get beaten in a pigsty isn't worth disturbing their own peace, is it?" She didn't reply. Her hands clutched the handles of the basket, lips trembling, but sealed shut. Michael walked slowly toward the old bedroom, the one that used to belong to Aiden. The room was empty. The wardrobe had been locked with a piece of wire. He broke it open. Inside were a pair of worn shoes, a tattered notebook with the cover torn off, and a frayed woolen scarf. He packed everything into a bag folded carefully without looking back. These items had no value, but they were the only proof that the boy had once lived as a person in this place. On the way out, he stopped in front of a bookshelf. Between books on child nutrition and developmental psychology, he found a small notebook with no name. He opened it. The handwriting was Aiden's, shaky and uneven. "If I behave well, Auntie says I can sit by the window, but today I coughed. I'm sorry for coughing. I'll try not to breathe loud." Michael gripped the notebook tightly. He said nothing. No one needed to hear the scream that echoed inside him. He walked back to the living room. On the wooden shelf near the wall, a new photo frame caught his eye. In it, Rachel was smiling brightly, her arm around a man in a light gray suit. He stepped closer. Didn't ask, just looked at it for a long time. When Rachel walked over, he finally spoke. "Does he know your son used to call pigs his only friends?" Rachel didn't respond. Her hand tightened slightly around the edge of her blouse. Michael turned away, picked up the envelope, and walked toward the door. Nothing in that house belonged to him anymore. But the documents did, because they were the only thing left that could prove Aiden was still part of him. Before leaving, Michael stopped at the threshold. Not to say anything, but to look back. One last time. "You didn't raise him like your own child. You just lived with him like he was a shadow. And you assumed shadows don't feel pain. But shadows are people too." The door closed quietly without a sound. But that silence might be the loudest thing left behind, slipping into every corner of that house, refusing to fade. Outside, the sky hadn't fully brightened. A cold breeze swept through, carrying the scent of damp soil and the late chirping of birds. Michael walked on paper envelope in hand, his shoulders not quite straight. But his steps didn't falter, because he knew that what needed to be kept was memory, and what needed to be buried were words that had never been true. Not every child who grows up without a mother's arms turns out hardened. Some souls just need a single glance, free of judgment, a gentle word not weighed down with expectation to make up for years spent curled up in silence. Sometimes people can't remember exactly when things began to change, but memory lingers like warm ashes in a dry season hearth. That night, the wind from the northern cornfield slipped through the metal roof above Michael Reese's home, carrying the dry scent of earth and the old pine timbers that framed the house. Aiden was asleep, though not deeply. His small hands still clutched a notebook filled with uneven lines only he could understand. Michael sat leaning against a smoke-stained wooden pillar, his gaze drifting past the harvested corn rows. The breeze whispered through the dry husks like a voice trying to say something ancient. The bamboo chair creaked beneath him, the fibers groaning as if they too understood the weight of a waiting that had no name. It wasn't the kind of waiting that came from longing for a person. It was the quiet intuition of a man who had once lain motionless between life and death and now felt once again that something was approaching, like rain that arrives in the night without warning. A dog barked sharply out by the alley. Not loud, not long, but just enough to make him tilt his head. Footsteps followed, slow, steady. A young man emerged into the edge of the lamplight hanging above the door. The glow fell across a faded jacket and a sun-worn face. "If you need something, just say it," Michael said without turning. The young man stopped and gave a slight nod. He placed both hands over his chest, fingers trembling slightly as if trying to steady a nervous energy. There was no plea or anger on his face, only a quiet kind of stillness, the kind that comes from standing for too long outside a family's door. "I heard there's a boy here. His name's Aiden." Michael didn't answer right away. He looked the young man over from head to toe, then replied simply, "Yes." The young man hesitated, then lifted his gaze toward the darkness beyond the porch. "I just wanted to know if her boy grew up like I did, alone, with no one calling him by his real name." Michael's voice slowed like he was walking backward through years he had never spoken aloud. "That child's name is Aiden. He's my son, and the woman you're talking about She's my sister. She left behind more than she'll ever be able to take back." The lamplight flickered slightly in the wind. The young man lowered his head. He stood there for a long time before speaking again. "My name's Daniel. I grew up at St. Mary's Orphanage since I was 4. No one knew where I came from. The file said I'd been left in the ER of a rural hospital. No name, no papers. A carpenter in Camargo took me in. I grew up with piles of scrap wood and the sound of saws, but there was always a hollow place in me." Michael didn't ask more. He stood and brought out an old wooden chair, gesturing for Daniel to sit. "So why do you want to see him now?" Daniel looked up at the eaves, then toward the doorway, where a soft light still glowed. Not to reclaim anything, not to reconnect or forgive, just to know if maybe one morning he ever woke up and felt the way I did. Like he didn't belong to anyone. Like no one was close enough to call Mom. The silence stretched over the porch like a light mist. Not cold, but still enough to make you hold your breath. After a long while, Michael stood quietly, went inside, and came back with an old wool coat. He draped it gently over Daniel's shoulders the way one might place trust on someone who just stepped out of the dark. That boy once ate pig scraps, was locked outside in the cold, but he's still alive, and he never asked why. He just learned to look people in the eye. The door creaked open. Aiden stepped out holding a small blanket. His eyes met Daniel's. There was no fear, no confusion, only the look of someone used to being awakened by things that couldn't be named. "This is Daniel," Michael said. Someone who once knew the word a mother in a very different way. Aiden was silent for a moment, then asked, "Do you know how to make things out of wood?" Daniel smiled slightly. His eyes flickered with something like regret. "A little. I used to sit alone and carve scraps into keychains. I'd take them to the weekend market. People looked, then walked away. They wanted something shiny and perfect, but the rough little things he made. No one ever chose them." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small item. It was a handmade keychain, rough but sturdy. In the center, the letter D was carved slightly slanted. Daniel handed it to Aiden. "I made this out of dry pine wood. If you decide to keep it, hold onto it tight, okay? I don't want it to fall. The way I once fell from the hands of the woman who called herself my mother." "Gee." Aiden took it. His small fingers ran gently over the wooden surface as if reading a story that had never been told out loud. A breeze brushed the edge of the roof like a quiet reminder from somewhere far away. The night was no longer still like before. It had grown thicker, deeper, as if holding another story that hadn't yet found its name. No one spoke, but Daniel's presence, calm and unassuming, created just enough space for a thin thread of trust to slip into a home that had been closed off for too long. There, no one needed a title to feel seen, but in the eyes of everyone present was a shared trace of something familiar, the quiet exhaustion of children who had been left behind, and the fragile hope of being allowed just once to stay somewhere and truly belong. A child can survive being abandoned, but that doesn't mean the wounds will heal on their own. Sometimes the only thing that can heal them is the timely presence of someone who has no reason to love, but chooses to stay anyway. No one talked about that day anymore. But for Michael, the memory was still etched as clearly as dried mud on the cuff of an old pair of jeans. It had been one of those days when the wind blew in from the wrong direction, carrying with it the smell of soil and 100 unnamed memories. That was when he saw the thick layer of dust clinging to the creases of his uniform, the same one he'd worn through years of service near the border, as if time itself had tried to forget something. He smoothed the cracked surface of his old faded leather wallet with a rough palm. Inside were his veteran ID, a few old dollar bills, and a photocopy of the family registration record he had just wrestled back from Rachel's house. On that document, one faint line stood out: child welfare beneficiary, legal guardian Rachel Monroe. Michael stared at the paper. It felt like someone had placed a small stone on his chest. The name Monroe had once been part of the family. Now it was a scar. He didn't tell anyone, didn't leave a message. He just walked quietly toward the Ridgefield Family Services office, a corner building more familiar to him in the years before he enlisted. On the smudged glass door, his reflection looked back at him, a silent man with lines on his forehead that no one had tried to smooth. He stepped inside, head slightly bowed as if not wanting to disturb the stillness inside. No one spoke. No one looked up. His presence felt like a breeze passing through, barely noticed. The indifference wasn't cruel, but it was enough to make someone feel lost. I need to check the welfare records filed under my son's name. Aiden Reese. The woman behind the counter didn't look up. She reached for a folder and typed on her keyboard, eyes still fixed on the screen. Listed guardian is Rachel Monroe. File has been active for 4 years. Michael tightened his grip on his backpack strap. I never gave her that authority. She raised an eyebrow and turned the screen toward him. I'm sorry, sir, but we have a signature on file. The signature was messy, nearly illegible. It wasn't his. I was stationed in Sonora near the border. I haven't been in this town for 4 years. What would a soldier sign when he's not even here? The room stayed quiet, but something in the woman's expression shifted. What had been indifference in her eyes now trembled, as if something inside her was urging her to speak. A small furrow appeared between her brows. She lowered her gaze and finally spoke, her voice soft and hesitant, each word climbing over a wall of fear and conscience. Her words didn't come loudly, but they carried more weight than any silence in the room. I can't say this officially, but if you know someone at the main office, ask them to pull the original file. Don't call it a favor. Call it a rescue. Michael left without another word. On his way out, he stopped by an old copy shop and asked them to print a full copy of the file under Aiden's name. The paper was still warm in his hand. On the sidewalk near the market, 2 kids were sharing a stale piece of bread. One of them had a thin frame just like Aiden's. When the boy saw Michael, he smiled brightly and waved before running off. The moment shattered inside Michael like a shard of memory too sharp to forget. By late afternoon, he returned to the temporary housing center. Aiden was playing with a few other kids. He was using chalk to write huge letters across the ground, freedom. The child who once feared the sound of his own voice now used each stroke as if he wanted to carve it into the earth itself. Standing off to the side where the sunlight was beginning to retreat toward the edge of the yard was a thin woman with her gray-streaked hair tied back with a faded cloth ribbon. It was Maria Collins, Aiden's former teacher, the one who had quietly left the school after Rachel accused her of stealing from the class fund. No one had defended her. No one had asked any questions. Mr. Reese, there are things no one wants to believe until they're the one who comes face to face with the truth. I knew this day would come for you. He didn't answer right away. The breeze drifted by, carrying the scent of ash. Inside him, what he felt wasn't just anger, but a deep regret for having stayed away too long, for not being there when his son needed him most. I still remember the last parent meeting before I left, when Rachel stood up, pointed at me, and said I had stolen $300 from the class fund. The whole room went silent, as if that accusation was automatically true. No one looked at me. No one asked a single question. The truth didn't have a voice that day. I believe you didn't do it. Back then, the truth wasn't what people wanted. They just needed a name to blame. And now, I'm not here to clear my name. I'm here because there's a child who stayed silent for 4 years. I don't want him to stay silent forever. Michael looked over at Aiden. The boy hadn't noticed anyone watching him. His cheeks were sun-kissed, his hands dusted with chalk, but his eyes were bright. Not the hazy kind of light lost children carry, but the steady glow of a seedling pushing through cracked earth. Do you have any proof that Rachel forged the documents? Maria nodded, her gaze steady on the lines etched into Michael's face. Carefully, she pulled a folded piece of paper from her handbag. The edges had yellowed with time. I kept an old photocopy of the original teacher's logbook. In the section where guardianship was noted, the name listed for Aiden was Emily, not Rachel. Later, when the school reprocessed the documents through administration, that section had been completely changed. I knew something wasn't right, but back then, who had the courage to speak up? Michael took the paper, his hands slightly trembling. Emily, his late wife, had been gone for years, but her signature was still there, as if the past had never really left, only waited for someone brave enough to open the page again. "I won't let this be buried again. Thank you for keeping this." Maria looked at him, her eyes softening in a way they hadn't for years, as if fear had kept them narrowed for too long. "We all hold on to something, not because we need it, but because we don't want anyone else to pretend it never mattered." Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's the hope that someone will finally listen. Memory doesn't live in old wallets or faded photographs. It lingers in the glance over a shoulder, in the breath held too long, in the footsteps retracing a road once walked away from. And now, Michael was learning to call the truth by its name, with every last part of himself that still remembered how, even if it was late, it wasn't too late. The sound of metal scraping slowly across the cement floor slipped through the air like it was dragging along heavy memories that hadn't yet faded. No one turned to look. No one dared take their eyes off the faces sitting up front. Overhead, the old ceiling fan spun lazily, its dry blades creaking like rotted wood, groaning in an abandoned house. The courtroom remained as it always was, where silence was never unusual, but part of the ritual, like the patience of someone who has waited through years of dust and wind for justice. Michael Reese sat with his back resting lightly against the wooden bench, both hands placed neatly on his thighs. He wore a white dress shirt slightly wrinkled at the collar, unpressed but clean. Between his knees was a small brown canvas bag, not large but enough to carry a part of the truth. Aidan wasn't there, not because he was afraid, but because Michael didn't want his son to witness his father once again having to measure his emotions before strangers. At the front of the room, behind the dark wooden bench, the judge tilted his wrist and struck the gavel 3 times. The sharp sound cut clean through the murky fog of quiet tension hanging in the room. Not loud, but sharp like a blade slicing through whispers that had just begun to rise. Rachel Monroe slowly raised her head. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun as if every strand had been placed to avoid disorder. Her face was lightly made up enough not to appear pale, but never quite radiant. Her beige dress clung to her frame, but it was her gaze that made the room seem even more compressed. She didn't smile. Her lips held a slight curve, something between a faint smile and the effort to conceal an unnamed feeling. It was as if this courtroom had become a speech she had memorized long ago. "Miss Monroe, do you have anything you wish to say before we move to the evidentiary phase?" the judge asked. His voice was not harsh but firm. Rachel stood. The tap of her heels against the floor made a small, distinct sound. She looked directly at the judge, then toward the prosecutor, and spoke softly. "I was only strict. I taught myself how to survive. I was left behind like a broken chair in an empty house. I didn't beat him. I disciplined him. I taught him how to live the way I had to." No one replied. A woman in the 3rd row shifted in her seat, but no one turned to look. Only the prosecutor reached for the thick file on his desk, removed a page from the middle, and stood up. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to submit the statement from the physician who treated the victim," he said. His tone was steady, clear, without emphasis. Dr. Helen Carter stepped forward. The light from the window caught the silver strands near her ear. "The boy wasn't afraid of pain. He didn't flinch when I touched the bruises, didn't even blink at the sight of a needle. What he feared was being forgotten. He was terrified that if he spoke, no one would hear. And when I asked for his name, he stared at me for a long time, as if in his whole life no one had ever called him by his real name more than 3 times. A breath caught in the middle row of the courtroom, but no one cried. Everything being said felt familiar, like the faded light of an early morning. The prosecutor gave a small nod. He turned and gestured for Daniel Monroe to step forward. The young man walked with a steady gait, but his shoulders carried a visible weight. He stopped in front of the stand, bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. The judge asked, "Mr. Monroe, you are the biological son of the defendant. Would you like to request leniency for your mother?" Daniel didn't look at the judge. He stared straight ahead, his voice low and calm. "I didn't come here to ask for leniency or harshness. I came to say, I haven't forgotten." An older man sitting at the back of the room gripped a worn notebook tightly. The sound of a page turning was barely audible, but no one noticed. All eyes were on the USB drive. The prosecutor was plugging into the computer. The screen lit up. There was no image, only sound. A child's voice, muffled and trembling, echoed through the heavy silence. "I'm sorry. Please don't lock me in there again. It's cold. I promise I won't talk anymore. Please, please." Rachel Monroe lowered her head. For the first time since the trial began, the prosecutor took a step back. No explanation was needed, but then he pulled out a second folder, thinner than the first. "Your Honor, we present supplemental evidence. A file submitted by Mrs. Linda Whitman, a relative on the late Emily Reese's side." The judge furrowed his brow. He flipped open the first page, read a line, then looked at Rachel. "According to this document, the late wife of the plaintiff, Ms. Emily Reese, was once romantically involved with Senator Victor Kane, who is at present the defendant's boyfriend. Do you deny this connection?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. Her eyes fixated on a distant point in the air. Her response came only after a pause, long enough to hear a pin drop. "I don't deny it, but it has nothing to do with this." The prosecutor didn't react. He simply set the folder gently on the table. "Then we are clear. The motive wasn't just money. It was envy, directed at someone no longer alive." The ceiling fan kept turning. Its creaking hum stretched into one more slow revolution. No one clapped. No one shed tears. But when the judge read the sentence, 12 years in prison without the possibility of reduction, not a single eye strayed from Michael Reese. He sat still. His hands held the old canvas bag. He didn't smile. He didn't bow his head, because some victories don't need to be celebrated out loud. They only need to stand upright in the face of a silence that once served as a weapon. The trial ended like a dry afternoon nap without dreams, but leaving behind the feeling of rain on the horizon. The wind slipped gently through the eucalyptus trees at the back of the yard, carrying the earthy scent that follows rain. A few fallen leaves spun in slow circles across the weathered cement. The backyard behind Michael's house was no longer just an empty space. It had begun to take on meaning, even a soul built by hands that were unskilled but full of patience. A long plank of wood rested across 2 bricks. Beside it was a 3-legged stool that Daniel was carefully repairing, trying to wedge in a 4th leg with a block of scrap wood. Aiden quietly swept dust from the old blackboard they had pulled out of a storage shed. It wasn't very large, and it was far from perfect, but his small hands moved slowly across the surface, wiping away the leftover chalk as if trying to erase the memories that still clung to it. Michael didn't step in right away. He sat on the steps holding a cold cup of coffee in his hand, like a habit he couldn't let go. His eyes followed every small movement, not to supervise, but simply to witness. Sometimes words weren't necessary. All it took was someone's gentle presence, like the breeze at the start of the day. And today he allowed himself to be that quiet shadow. "You thinking about teaching?" he asked, not looking directly but loud enough for the boys to hear. Aiden looked up and wiped his hands on the hem of his worn shirt. He hesitated, then gave a soft smile. "Not exactly. I just don't want the kids to feel like words are something that make them less than everyone else." Daniel paused mid-swing of the hammer, then continued working. No one else said anything, but the silence carried a kind of tenderness, as if something had quietly opened inside each of them. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no flags, no red tape. But that morning on the cracked cement floor, the first class took shape, simple, quiet, and full of warmth. An old woman from the edge of town passed by. She set down a bag of white rice on the step, then turned and walked away without saying a word. She didn't need thanks. She simply stood at a distance, watching the blackboard and the children laughing together. Maybe she saw a glimpse of herself in them, from the days when she tied her hair with string and dreamed of learning letters in the middle of the fields. Later that afternoon, there was the soft clatter of a makeshift tricycle cart. An old man, his face tanned by years of sun, arrived carrying a broken chair. He didn't say much. He looked toward the yard, parked the cart, and sat down to wait. Daniel brought out his tools. Aiden walked over and whispered, "Are we going to charge him for this?" Daniel smiled, squinting a little in the sun. "No, not money. We'll trade it for something real. A memory, a story he hasn't told anyone yet, but he'll tell the kids. That chair will get old again, but stories those last. The old man nodded. The gap-toothed smile behind his wrinkled skin seemed to agree deeply. Maybe even with a bit of relief, because at last, there was a place where old people weren't seen as useless. Not long after Mrs. Margaret Collins, the quietest neighbor on the block, showed up unexpectedly. She carried a bundle of dried fish under one arm and a small bag of rice over her shoulder. She stood by the fence for a long moment, then called out, "I've got some sticky rice and dried fish. If you don't mind, I'd like to cook a pot of rice." Michael didn't say anything. He just nodded. Aiden smiled too, not the way kids smile at adults, but the way someone smiles when they know something new is finally beginning in a place that once felt impossible. Mrs. Collins murmured as she placed the pot over the wood stove. "I stayed quiet back then because I was afraid. I'm still afraid now, but I'm not hiding anymore. So let me cook this pot of rice as a way of saying what I never said." As the pots clanged and clattered in the kitchen, the smell of dried fish and fried onions began to drift through the air. No one gave instructions, but someone stepped in to wash the vegetables, someone else stoked the coals. The atmosphere flowed quietly, like a stream gently soothing old wounds. The children appeared in small groups like raindrops soaking into dry earth. One brought along a notebook with a torn spine. Another clutched a broken piece of chalk in the palm of their hand. Some brought nothing at all, just stood quietly behind a tree trunk, wide-eyed as if waiting for someone to call their name from a world they had never been invited into. Aiden didn't force anyone. He simply stood in front of the board, his voice steady and slow. "Who wants to write their name up here?" A small hand timidly rose. Then another, trembling slightly but firm in its intention. Eyes met, no longer hesitant, gradually lit up by a fragile, unfamiliar trust. When the first shaky letters appeared on the board, unsteady but brave, the air in the yard seemed to freeze for just a moment, then slowly soften again, as if bearing witness to a quiet kind of miracle. Michael watched it all from the porch steps. In his hand was a cup of coffee, now cold. But inside him something warmer had begun to stir, a kind of warmth that years of resistance and exhaustion had never brought. Hope that didn't come from applause, but from the quiet hands mending broken lives in silence. The walls were still temporary, the floor scattered with bits of loose gravel. But inside the laughter of children, the sound of chalk scraping across the board and the tapping of a hammer on wood echoed like the raw orchestra of an everyday celebration. No one asked Michael why he was doing this. They just stopped by, left behind a few old books, a handful of nails, sometimes even a broken fan. And they asked, "Is there room here for someone who can help with odd jobs?" Michael had never imagined that from the very place that once broke him, he could build something that helped others stand. Turns out what is old and broken doesn't need to be brought back with sorrow, but with quiet and steady presence. All it takes is a door that never closes and a kind of belief that doesn't ask anyone to be perfect before stepping through. A quiet community was beginning to form. Not born from a courtroom, ruling not driven by pity, it began with a chalkboard, a chair that had been repaired, and a pot of rice simmering over a coal stove. And then people realized living is a blessing, but living together, truly together, is what resurrection feels like. The ashes in the old stove had cooled from the day before, but the warmth still lingered, as if the remnants of the past had not vanished completely, only settled quietly beneath the tiles. Among the gray ash were bits of dark brown cinnamon bark, releasing a scent that was neither sharp nor sweet, but somewhere in between, spicy, gentle, and haunting. Daniel stood silently in front of the stove, his gaze not fixed on anything in particular. In his hand was a crumpled envelope, one corner torn, the ink smeared as if it had once been touched by water. He hadn't read the letter right away, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't know what emotion he should bring to it. The envelope had been sent from Santa Maria Correctional Facility. The sender's name was not unfamiliar, Rachel, but what made his heart falter wasn't the name, it was the handwriting, slanted, consistent, carefully neat. as if the writer had sat for a long time to choose each word, the way someone chooses their last words to a loved one they'll never see again. Daniel hadn't said anything to anyone in the house. He had simply slipped the letter into the pocket of his shirt near his chest, as if hiding something fragile. Then he walked out to the backyard where the old stove stood, and a small patch of chili and herbs grew. The sun had just gone down, and the light was fading into the color of ash. A person's heart could be like that too. Too much clarity could be confusing. Too much darkness made it hard to move. There had to be a space in between for the things without a name. Michael was by the chicken coop fiddling with something. One of his gloves had torn and dirt clung beneath his nails. He looked up when he heard his nephew's footsteps. Nothing obvious seemed wrong, just a slightly slower pace, his shoulders drawn in, but Michael knew. Something had just happened, or was about to. "Something wrong, Daniel?" Michael asked, his voice low, as if afraid to touch a wound that hadn't yet formed a scab. Daniel sat down next to the stove and pulled the letter from his pocket. "It's from prison," he said softly. "From her." Michael didn't ask anything else. He already understood what was wrapped inside those 3 words. And he knew there were things you shouldn't question, only wait for someone to be ready to speak. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of wind moving through the leaves, baby chicks chirping and dry grass rustling under worn shoes. Daniel opened the letter. The paper was thin, almost translucent in the dim light. He read quickly, as if pausing too long on any one line might rob him of the strength to go on. There were no tears in his eyes, but his eyebrows pinched together, and the fingers holding the paper trembled slightly. "Even now, she still insists she wasn't wrong," Daniel said under his breath. "Just not strong enough to choose differently." Michael sat down beside him. He didn't touch the letter, nor did he search for Daniel's eyes. He just looked quietly into the ashes, as if he were looking for something of himself in there. Sometimes it's only when we are at our weakest that we discover the strongest part of our heart. He said, his voice slow like wind slipping through dry leaves. Not everyone has the courage to bow their head and ask to be forgiven. Esteban folded the letter. He placed it on the edge of the rusted iron shovel, then bent down to gather a few dry twigs, setting them carefully into the fire pit, as if handling something fragile. The flame caught slowly, timid red threads creeping along the paper's edge, just like the writer herself, no longer proud, just weary, trying to send off a final warmth, a goodbye she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. "Are you going to keep it?" Michael asked as the fire began to lick the first line of handwriting. "Keep it for who?" Esteban replied, eyes fixed on the flames. "She's not my mother anymore. And I'm not the kid who used to hope she'd come back." The words fell into the space between them like a pebble dropped down a dry well. No ripples, but they echoed for a long time. Michael swallowed hard. He knew Esteban wasn't angry, and he wasn't sad anymore either. It was just a scar long-healed that still stung when touched. After a pause, Esteban spoke again, his voice low but clear. "When I was little, I used to pray she would die." Michael turned his head slightly, something unnamed flickering in his eyes. "She didn't die," Esteban continued. "She's in prison now, and I'm out here. I guess that's fair." Neither of them said another word. The fire consumed most of the letter. The ink disappeared before there was time to read it again. The ashes lifted, caught by the breeze, slipping in from the back alley, then scattered completely. Only a few glowing embers and the scorched edge of the shovel remained. Esteban bent down, picked up a few still warm coals and stamped them out with the heel of his boot. The heat pushed through the soul enough to make him wince, but he didn't say anything. He gathered the small bits together as if collecting the remains of something that once bloomed in a season of corn. The old clock inside the house rang out each chime, falling like a slow drop of water onto worn stone. The sound crept through the roof tiles, seeped into the moss-covered patio, and faded into the evening wind. Some sounds don't need an audience to be heard. Like time, they drift on indifferent, choosing no one, moving on just the same. Michael stood up and brushed the dust from his hands. He started to walk away, but then turned back. He didn't ask anything. Instead, he placed a hand gently on Esteban's shoulder, a simple gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. Esteban didn't look at him. He just said, "I don't know if she wrote that letter out of guilt or because she was scared to die alone, but I don't have enough space left inside to hold any more of it." People, Michael said, not all of them deserve forgiveness, but everyone should have a chance to say one final thing. That wasn't meant to excuse anyone. It was the reflection of someone who had lived long enough to understand that sometimes forgiveness isn't about whether the other person deserves it. It's about lightening your own burden. In the end, forgiveness is a blessing, not a debt to be repaid. The ashes cooled. The fire went out completely. Esteban stood, the scent of smoke still clinging to his hands. There was no anger in his eyes and no forgiveness either. Just a quiet space wide enough for the past to stop creeping into his sleep. And maybe that was the beginning of freedom. The morning breeze wasn't harsh. It brushed gently against the clotheslines behind the row of classrooms, making the old shirts that students had brought to change into after gym class sway slightly. The smell of chalk dust still lingered in the air, mixed with the scent of dry earth and the dampness of old stone walls weathered by time. The schoolyard, once bare red dirt, was now neatly paved with bricks, each one laid quietly by parents' hands in late afternoons, with no ceremony, no ribbon cutting, only the sound of heavy breathing and a trust that needed no words. Michael Reese stood behind the window holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His eyes didn't rest on the kids gathering in the corner of the yard. Instead, he looked farther down the dirt road where the dust had just settled and fresh tire tracks were still visible on the damp ground. He didn't need to say a word to know that today wouldn't be like any other day. He just didn't know whether the change it would bring was a beginning or an end. A silver-gray car pulled up in front of the gate without sounding any alert. The driver waited patiently for a moment, then got out and walked around to open the passenger door. The man who stepped out was neatly dressed, wearing a crisp white shirt, gray slacks, and a small name tag pinned to his lapel. In his hands was a deep red folder wrapped in soft leather, the kind of item that had clearly been through many trips but was still treated with care. His face didn't carry the stiff expression of a government official, but rather the look of someone who had heard more sad stories than the number of documents he had signed. The children fell instantly silent. Some clutched each other's hands, others hid behind the pillars of the building. But all eyes followed the stranger. Only Aiden remained in the classroom, carefully tracing out the curved lines of a letter in his writing notebook. He didn't pay attention to the footsteps or the murmurs outside. For Aiden, today was just another lesson. He didn't yet know that the name he was about to write would carry meaning far beyond the letters themselves. The man walked up the steps and stopped in front of Michael. They looked at each other for a moment. There was no formal handshake, no drawn-out introduction, just one sentence. "We're here on behalf of the Regional Board of Education to officially certify the Mendoza Community Center." Michael nodded slightly, his eyes still following the faint tire marks disappearing down the end of the dirt road. "I know. The kids here already helped me read what it says." The official tilted his head slightly, his gaze drifting toward the group of children gathered by the classroom door. He raised the folder gently, as if offering it, then spoke in a tone that was part suggestion, part question. "If you think it's appropriate, we could do a simple recognition ceremony right here. A few reporters are waiting outside, hoping to witness the event." Michael interrupted with a calm shake of his head. He set his coffee cup down on the window ledge. "I don't need a certificate of honor. I haven't done anything grand. I just once heard my own child cry in silence, and I chose not to ignore it." The official didn't respond. He placed the folder on the old wooden desk inside the classroom, right next to the worn-down jar of colored chalk. Before leaving, he offered one last remark. "There are places that don't need their names in a file, because they already live in people's hearts." Aiden looked up as he saw his father walk into the room. The boy stood up holding a piece of white chalk tightly in his hand. Michael didn't say anything. He simply stepped to the side as if making space for his son. Aiden walked to the chalkboard, his face more serious than his age. He wrote slowly, each stroke measured as if timed with his breathing. A, I, D, E-N. The sound of the chalk dragging across the board was steady and soft, yet every child watching held their breath as if listening to a sacred melody. When he finished, Aiden turned around, his eyes meeting his father's. "Dad, I wrote it." Michael nodded and stepped closer. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice warm and steady. "Your name is yours. No one has the right to write it for you." The other children around them stayed quiet for a long moment. A small girl whispered, "Is the letter W for wind teacher?" Aiden looked out the window, where the leaves outside were gently rustling. "No, but even the wind needs a name to know where it belongs." Hati. No one laughed, no one clapped, but the children's eyes had changed. They were no longer just learning how to read, they were learning how to name themselves. The lesson went on with simple practice exercises. But that day, no one copied from the board. Each child wrote their own name, even if the letters were shaky, even if their hands still trembled. Michael sat in the back of the room, wiping down the board while observing. He didn't teach, he didn't correct. He let the children shape their own letters, as if shaping the voice that would someday carry them out of the years they had spent in silence. The afternoon sun cast a long, slanted light through the classroom window, stretching across the tiled floor dusted with chalk. Far off in the distance, thick clouds began to blanket the sky like a heavy quilt. The rain didn't pour. It only whispered a gentle warning, just enough to darken the schoolyard and speckle the children's shirts with moisture. Aiden walked up to the board with a soft cloth in hand, ready to erase the name he had written. But Michael gently held his wrist. "Leave it. Your name should stay there a little longer." He locked the classroom door. His hand still felt warm from resting on his son's shoulder. Standing on the steps, he looked out at the dimming yard, as if waiting for a quiet sign from the earth or sky. But no one came. No bird crossed the gray air. Only the steady chirping of crickets in the hedges and the scent of damp soil rising, mixing with the smell of fallen leaves at the end of the season. In that moment, memory returned like a wisp of smoke curling into Michael's mind. He remembered his first day back, the way he had stood frozen watching his son beside the feeding trough, silently picking at scraps meant for animals. The empty look in the boy's eyes had cut deeper than any wound Michael had ever carried. And today, in that same boy's bright eyes as he wrote his own name, Michael saw something come back to life, something no words could truly describe. They had once forced that boy to eat pig slop. Now he was teaching other children how to read the letter S in self-esteem. Life doesn't always give us a second chance, but sometimes all it takes is one person, someone who stops, listens, and loves at the right moment, and an entire life can change course. The boy who once ate from a trough, who lived in silence and endurance, today wrote his name on the board. Not just a name, but a declaration of dignity. And the father, once a soldier trained to follow orders and endure the sound of gunfire, chose to stand quietly before the blackboard so his son could write his own future. Have you ever witnessed a child be silenced? Have you ever seen a father who didn't know how to hold his child? And if you yourself carry the weight of childhood pain, do you believe that the right kind of love, given at the right time, can truly heal? If you've experienced something similar, or if Aiden's story touched something in your heart, leave a comment below. Your story might give someone else out there a little more hope. And don't forget to click subscribe so you won't miss these stories that speak to the soul, real-life moments that remind us goodness still exists, and justice, even when delayed, will come. Lastly, I truly care about you. How are you feeling today? Is there something weighing on your heart? Share it if you'd like. Maybe together we can get through it, through a story, a message, or just a little heart emoji beneath this video. Thank you for staying until the very end. You're not alone.